Welcome back to Train Signal's Citrix XenApp training. You're watching Installing and Configuring Citrix Plugins. Alright, so far we've been talking about configuring XenApp servers, installing XenApp servers, publishing applications, configuring applications. We've talked about a lot of stuff. In this lesson, what we're going to focus on is how do we get the endpoints, how do we get the users to connect to these resources? Because after all, the most important thing of everything that we're doing is to give users access to content and resources and applications. So in this lesson, we're going to focus on how many plugins, how many clients, and a plugin, by the way, is another way of saying it's a client. It's a piece of software that gets installed on an endpoint, or a lot of endpoints like thin clients and iPads and iPhones can have a piece of software that can be installed on them as well, or you can have devices that have pre-installed applications or software that allows you to connect to Citrix infrastructures. So we're going to talk about the broad plugins or the many matrices that Citrix has for clients. Then we're going to talk about how you can customize one of the Citrix plugins, probably the most popular one of all, the online plugin. We're going to talk about how we can create a web interface XenApp plugin site. So in addition to the online plugin being its own instance, an instance that you can use to connect to applications, you can use it in conjunction with a XenApp site, which helps populate the applications, configure it, and tweak it. So there's a lot of different ways by which you can give users access to applications and resources, and we're going to visit that. But one of them is creating a services site to configure these plugins that are installed. We're then going to talk about how you can install and configure the online plugin through command line, and we're also going to talk about how you can install and configure the offline plugin via command line. So the plugin matrix, Citrix has a lot of plugins, and these plugins have been renamed over the course of years. Citrix has this flavor, this fling for colorful names. So we went from MetaFrame clients to online plugins and offline plugins and the use of the word plugin and so on and so forth. So the Citrix Online plugin is the main plugin or the main client that you use to connect to applications and resources, and that same plugin has many sub-features, as we're going to see a little later on. But you can also use this online plugin to connect to a web interface site so that the web interface site can populate and enumerate the applications and resources that the user has access to. Or you can use the online plugin as a standalone piece of software that helps push these resources to either the start menu or the desktop and allows you to connect without having a need for anything else. So we're going to talk about that. Then you have the Citrix Web plugin. The Citrix Web plugin is again an extension to the online plugin. It's a very small footprint, so to speak. It's a very thin client or thin plugin that you can install and deploy that basically just gives you web functionality. It typically works in conjunction with the web interface where you visit a website, you log in, get applications, and you connect that way. It doesn't have any functionality, nothing that you configure locally on that device where you're installing it. The Citrix Offline plugin is used when you're streaming applications directly to devices, and we talked about that in the earlier lessons. You will need the Citrix Offline plugin in order to be able to launch these applications, but you also need the offline plugin in the event that you want to take these streamed applications offline where there is no network connection and you want to continue to be able to connect to them and launch them and use them. You would need the Citrix Offline plugin. The Citrix Self-Service plugin, in parentheses Dazzle, depending on the month of the year, this might be Dazzle or it might be the self-service plugin. So depending on what the marketing department at Citrix is doing, this could change. The self-service plugin, what it does is, in addition to delivering applications through the web interface and through the web plugin and the offline plugin and so on and so forth, you have the ability of creating what's known as a merchandise server and creating like an online store, very similar to the Apple online store or iTunes, where users visit a web page and have access to applications, whereby you're not specifying which user has access to which application, but you're giving them an online store of applications that is sort of self-service, and they can try to access these applications and you can put restrictions around it. It's a little outside of the scope of this course, but I wanted to explain to you and make you aware that this particular service exists and this particular plugin exists. Now, you see how many plugins there are? There's a lot of plugins for the different technologies that you're connecting to into a Citrix infrastructure. Citrix recognizes this, And for this particular reason, they've created the Citrix receiver. Now, the Citrix receiver is a framework. It's a piece of software that you can install on the client and then use all of the other plugins to sort of connect into the Citrix receiver. So you have one interface that has all of these plugins connect to it, so that when you want to update them, you're pushing the update to the Citrix receiver and it takes care of everything. Now, the Citrix receiver is interesting because its evolution is going to be, in my opinion, epic. We are going to get to a point with Citrix, and I know that's down the road, where we're getting rid of all these plugins and the Citrix receiver is the single piece of software you have to install in order to access all these different resources. And I know Citrix is working on that. Furthermore, as we start talking about the web interface, I will tell you what's coming or what's in plan for the Citrix receiver with regards to web interface, because later down the road the web interface is also going to go away and will be completely replaced by the Citrix receiver that's installed locally. So the Citrix receiver is definitely something to keep an eye on, but today the way it exists is you install it and all the other plugins that you install get sort of plug into it. So you still have to have a separate installation for them. It just gives you a framework to manage them a little easier. The Citrix receiver, one final note on that, is also what you would see when you're going into the, if you're installing into an iPad or a Droid device or an iPhone. That's typically the piece of software that gets installed, so you can see how that will evolve eventually to just take on everything. Alright, so customizing the online plugin. So we're going to talk about how you can customize the settings via command line, how you can install, tweak it, change it. For those of you that love to script things, that want to be creative, that just want to create a nifty little script that maybe will go out and install the correct plugins and features and functionality that you want, I'm going to go through some of the command line options you have. And then the other thing to be aware of is that with every Citrix client, you'll find in the directory that there's an ICA client.adm. Now, the ICA client.adm, as you may have guessed, is a file that you can import into group policy objects, and you'll be able to manage and manipulate a lot of the client settings using group policy, and we're going to go through that during the demonstration portion. But I wanted you to be aware that every client will come with this ADM, and you'll be able to load it in and do the customization that way. Now, the other thing to pay attention to is that the online plugin, while it's an executable, it is a collection of MSI files within that particular plugin. And as you'll see here, these are the MSI files that exist within the executable of the online plugin. There's no reason why you can't extract that executable, the online plugin executable, and install these MSI packages individually. You might only want to install the ICA web wrapper, or you might only want to install the single sign-on web wrapper, so on and so forth. So these are components within that same file that you can extract and install individually if you choose to do so, if it makes sense, or if maybe you're trying to make that particular file a little smaller and you don't need all of these particular packages in it. So there might be a number of reasons why you want to address it. So the online plugin command line install, it has a lot of features, has a lot of functionality, and you can tweak it any number of ways. So this is the command that you would launch basically to install. And remember, we said the executable has all these MSI files, and then it's followed by options, and you can do the same thing with the web, right? So the options that you can use, obviously, if you do a /?, it's just like doing /help, display some help. No reboot will not reboot it. Silent will basically go through the whole installation silently. You won't get prompted for anything. And then you have the option of getting a little more granular and specifying more values as to what you're trying to do. So for example, you can customize the installation directory where you're trying to install this particular package on the endpoint or on the endpoint device. Typically by default, C program file Citrix ICA client. You can change the client name. If you don't want the client name to be what the machine name is, you can also change that, etc., etc. So there's a lot of options, and if we continue here, you'll see that you can enable dynamic client name yes or no. So you can change that, flip the switch on and off. You can add local here. What this basically means is that, remember those MSI packages that I showed you earlier? You can specify which of those MSI packages you want to include and which you don't want to include. And then you have the ICA client installs the ICA web plugin. The PN agent will install the online plugin. So again, the PN agent here, which is the online plugin, is what's going to allow you to connect to Citrix web interface XenApp services site and use the XenApp services site to enumerate applications and so on and so forth. The SSON is the single sign-on plugin. Again, we discussed that in the desktop viewer, the Flash, etc., etc. So you have a lot of functionality, a lot of ways by which you can configure from a command line install perspective. Furthermore, the online plugin command line install, if we continue here, again, you'll see there's any number of features that you can tweak. I'm not going to go through all of them, but I wanted to display them on the screen here for you. You can feel free to pause the video and see what are the command line parameters that you can add to your particular script when you are creating it or developing it. And if I was to give you an example of what a script would look like, yes, it could be a little long, but in this example, what we're doing is the following. So we're installing the online plugin without visible. So we're doing it without visibility. So what we're doing here is we're installing it silently, basically. We're installing only the web plugin, so ICA client, etc., etc. So these are all of the things that we're doing in this particular command line here, which helps you in constructing your particular script if you choose to do a command line install. The offline plugin also has a rich command line parameters and features and functionality. So I've also listed all of them here. For the most part, they're pretty self-explanatory, and you won't use those unless you're, again, trying to customize the installation of your offline plugin. But I wanted you to be aware that this does exist and how you would be able to access it. Now, considering that was a lot of information, and I know some of you might want to be able to cut and paste and be able to customize the script that way, I've provided the direct links to the Citrix website. Now, granted, these are a little long, they're long links, but you'll be able to at least access those particular websites if you want to just do copy and paste in order to construct your scripts a little easier. All right, let's go ahead and switch to our demo portion now and go through some demonstrations. Okay, so we're connected to our Windows XP machine, and in this case it's called NCOM Client 01. And as you'll notice, I've downloaded the online plugin and the offline plugin. Now if we go into the folder of the offline plugin, you'll see that there's just one executable and just the metadata file in here. And in the online plugin folder, there is the full client, and then there's just the web client. So this will give us access to the PN agent, which again will allow us to connect to a web interface XenApp services site after we create it. So for the purpose of this demonstration, because this is sort of going to encompass this web client or web plugin, we're going to focus our attention and all the demonstrations on the full client. Now, if I double click on it and go through the installation, you'll notice the installation is very, very boring. There isn't even a single prompt, and we'll go through that. But before doing that, what I wanted to show you is if you open a command prompt here and we go to the desktop, do a click dir, and we do a cd, and if we go into the online plugin here, if we do a dir again, let's go ahead and take a look at what happens if I do Citrix online, plugin full.exe, and I do /? This again will bring up the same parameters and the same things that we talked about during the presentation portion of this lesson. So this is some of the command line parameters that you can add to this particular command. So I just wanted to show you, where you could find that and how you can initiate that. Now again, you'll notice that this is very, very straightforward. So let's go ahead and double click on it and see what happens. Again, very, very straightforward, and you can even remove this particular interface that's being installed now by basically just putting the /silent, for example, parameter if you're doing that from a command line, and it won't even display that, hey, this is being installed anymore. It's just a completely silent installation per se. And voila, that's all there is to it. It completely installed the online plugin. Now, what it's prompting us for here is, hey, I need a XenApp services site that I can connect to in order to enumerate my applications. So what I'm going to do now is we're going to switch over to our web interface site, and we're going to configure a XenApp services site for this particular plugin so we see how it functions. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go up here. I'm using VMware Workstation, so if the mouse goes up, I'm just switching between VMs basically, so it'll just makes it easier for me to toggle between them. So we're back here on our XenApp 01 server. What I'm going to do is we're going to go into all programs, and we're going to expand on Citrix, and we're going to launch the Citrix Server Role Manager here. Remember when we were installing XenApp, we configured XenApp, but we never touched web interface. So you can do that by coming back to the role manager and clicking on configure. But just in case you were wondering, you can also do this by clicking on all programs here, going up to Citrix and dragging down to management consoles, and you want to go into the web interface management console. This would also launch the same particular setting that or screen that we're about to see here. Once you've launched the Citrix Web Interface Management Console, we'll have two nodes. For now, we're just going to focus on XenApp Services sites. In order to create one, we're going to right-click on it, click on Create Site, and again, the installation of a site, or the creation of a site, is very basic, very straightforward. Where do you want to create this particular site? We're going to do this since there's IIS on the server. We're going to do this under the default website. This is the path, and you can feel free to name it whatever you want, because this is sort of a carryover for Citrix. It's called PN Agent because the plugin used to be called the PN Agent plugin or PN Agent client. So we're just going to keep this at default. Click on Next. And it's going to go through and create all the HTMLs, all the particular settings and configuration files that it needs for this particular site. Now, when it's done, what it's going to prompt us to do is go through and configure this particular site so that it's ready for the plugin to communicate with it and do its thing. Once it's done, we're going to make sure the checkbox is still checked to configure. We're going to click on Next. At this point, it's asking, hey, what form do you want to configure? We want to configure NCOM. And it's prompting you to put in a server. It needs a server that has the XML service running on it, because the XML service is what it's going to communicate with in order to enumerate these applications. So because the server that we're on is a XenApp server, you can always use localhost, or you can put in XA01, which is the name of our server. Click OK. Now, our XML service is running on port 80. If yours wasn't, you'd have to change it here. And our particular transport protocol is HTTPS. If you are using any other protocol, this is where you would specify it. However, there would be additional steps that would need to be configured, and we'll talk about those when we talk about securing XenApp. So for now, I'm going to keep it at HTTP and click on Next. What type of site are you trying to create? Are you creating a site that will only be used to connect to online resources, like published applications, published desktops, and content? Or are you creating a site that will allow access to only offline applications, streamed applications, etc.? Or are you creating a dual mode website? Again, for our purposes, we're creating a dual mode website depending on what you're creating this site for, because you can have more than one web interface services site within your organization, and depending on what you're creating it for, you might want the users connecting to a particular services site to have only online access or only offline access. So again, you can have more than one. For our purposes, we're going to go with dual so we can demonstrate both. We're going to click on Next, and we're going to click on Finish. And that pretty much configures the main configuration settings that we need in order to allow the client to connect. Now, in the later lesson, we're going to talk about how we can go into the different settings. But for now, I just wanted to create a framework that would allow us to connect to the PN Agent site. So I'm going to flip back over to NCOM Client 01. And what we're going to do in here is we're going to enter the address of our web interface server that has the client services site or the XenApp services site on it. So in our case, it's XA01. We're going to click on Update. And now it prompts us to put in a username and password. So in my case, I'm going to go ahead and put in administrator. I'm going to put in my password, and the domain is NCOM. Once I do that, you'll notice that the installation is now complete. We're going to click on OK. And down here, if I click on the up arrow, I have the icon for the online plugin. If I right-click on it, drag up here to Application, Refresh, click on the up arrow again, right-click on it. Whoops, I have no applications. Now, what happened? Anyone? Now here's the thing. This was an error on my part. I made a mistake, but what we're going to do is we are going to correct this together. So what am I missing? Why am I not able to see any applications? It's obvious that I'm properly connected, so the communication is there. Everything is cool. The installation was successful. What am I missing? So if anyone said, well, you don't have access to any applications, then you guys are absolutely correct. So what we're going to do is we're going to switch back over to XA01, and we are going to launch our Delivery Services console. Under the Applications, let's see if I have access to CNN. So I'm going to right-click on CNN, go to Application Properties, and we're going to go to Users. Now you'll notice the user I'm logged in with onto Encom Client must not be part of read-only. So what I'm going to do is click on Add, and let's go ahead and do Encom here, and go ahead and add that particular user. Now to make it easy, what I'm going to do is just add users here. We're going to do Encom, and we're going to do /administrator. Let's go ahead and click on OK. Let's click on OK here and here. Now, is there an easier way for me to do this? Instead of adding users manually one by one to applications, what did we do in the beginning? So let's go to WinRAR here, and let's go to Application Properties. If we go to Users, you'll notice that I've added a group. So if you go into Active Directory and add that particular user to this particular Active Directory group, well, then that user would automatically get access to that application, and they wouldn't have to come in here and specifically grant access to a particular user in this case. But since we've already gone through this now, let's go ahead and see if we can go back to Encom Client 01 and see if we can refresh applications now. So what I'm going to do up here is up arrow again, right click on the icon, application refresh, and let's see what happens this time. And voila. Now we have access to CNN and we have access to WinRAR. Now here's another question for you. Why don't we have access to FileZilla? We gave the user access to FileZilla, so I know it's not a permissions issue. The user has access to it. What's the problem? Well, the problem is that FileZilla is a streamed application. In order for you to have access to a streamed application, you have to install the offline plugin, which is what we're going to do next. But before that, if you wanted to launch WinRAR at this point, you can click on the icon. And there you go. Now you've just launched WinRAR on this particular client without actually having to install it on this client. Now we can further customize this by pushing WinRAR to the desktop or putting WinRAR into the start menu. So if I wanted to push it to my desktop and I wanted to push it to the start menu, let's go back into the application properties and see how I would do that. So I'm going to go back to XA01. On the Delivery Services console, what we're going to do is right click on WinRAR, go to Application Properties here, and we're going to drag down to Shortcut Presentation. Now here what I'm going to do is, hey, I want to push this to the start menu, and I want to put it in a folder called Citrix Applications. And I also wanted you to display this on the desktop. So what's going to happen now is the WinRAR application is going to be put into a folder in the start menu called Citrix Applications, and it's also going to be displayed on the user's desktop. So if I click on OK, and we switch back over here to Encom Client, let's go ahead and click the up arrow again, right click, let's do Application Refresh here, and voila. You'll see that it automatically showed up here. Now let's see if it's also in my programs here. Citrix Applications, and voila. WinRAR is now in Citrix Applications. Now you notice that CNN and the Community Desktop are also showing up, which means they are not being pointed or they're not being directed to be installed or to be located under the Citrix Applications folder. So let's go ahead and remedy that. So if I switch back to XA01, and let's go ahead and start with the Community Desktop Application Properties. Let's go down here to Shortcut Presentation. And we want this to show up under Citrix Applications. Click on OK. And let's also do the same thing for CNN here. And we're going to click on OK. Now let's go back to Encom Client. Let's do the up arrow, right click. Let's do application refresh. And let's see if it reorganized things. So all programs, Citrix applications, voila. It configured everything. Now you're probably looking at it and saying, hey, hello, boy genius, they're still up there. So this is about to become a little tricky, so I need you guys to follow along just a little closer here. So remember when we were talking about installing the online plugin, it's sort of like a mixture of technically two clients that are installed. One client is the XenApp plugin, which you can use without a web interface server. So you can use by deploying the application onto a desktop like we did, launch applications all day long. You don't need a web interface site. Now, the other option was to interface to connect with a XenApp services site, and you saw how we put in the address of our web interface services site and connected, and that gave you this little icon down here which interfaces with what's happening on web interface. So what we need to do now is that you have two portions of the plugin pushing applications down to the desktop, and we have to organize them properly. Now pay attention to what's happening here. There's no folder here, right? Alright. And we want to get rid of the icons that are showing up on the start menu here that the PN agent, so to speak, is pushing down. So let's go back to XA01. On the Delivery Services console, if I right-click CNN and drag down to Application Properties, let's go into Shortcut Presentation. So the section down here configures just the XenApp plugin features. So you're organizing the applications that the XenApp plugin is displaying. If you create a folder up here, what's happening is you're creating a folder within web interface. So when a user opens a web browser, goes to web interface, logs in, they will see that particular folder. Now remember, the PN agent plugin that we installed interfaces with web interface. So whatever folder you put here, that agent is going to be able to see it. If you wanted to organize your applications under Citrix applications so they're in the same place, you can just organize them like this and click on OK. And let's do the same thing for Community Desktop. Gotta go down here to Shortcut Presentation. And let's take a look at the properties of WinRAR. WinRAR doesn't have it, and we're going to keep it that way. Let's go back to our Encom Client 01 and see what happens when we do an application refresh. And let's try and see what happened now. Right click, Applications, voila. So we created a folder that shows up on web interface. This particular client automatically grabbed it and organized CNN that way. You'll notice we didn't do that for WinRAR, so WinRAR still remains in the root. And I also wanted to show you that desktops are organized differently than applications and resources. So desktops will always show up under the desktop folder and applications and resources under here. So let's go see what happened on the start menu now. If we click on all programs, voila, it's gone from up there. It's consolidated all of the applications down here. Now you'll notice WinRAR is still here, again because we did not specify WinRAR, we left it specifically outside of that folder. Alright, so now let's focus our attention on how we can display the streamed applications also as part of our application availability. So I'm going to double click on the folder here, and we're just going to go through a very simple installation of the offline plugin. Now the difference between the online plugin and the offline plugin is you'll notice the offline plugin has a couple prompts that it prompts you for, whereas the online plugin went very quickly. Click on next, you're going to accept license agreement, you're going to accept the path or change it, and bada bing bada boom. That's all you need to do basically for the offline plugin. Now it might prompt you for a reboot after the installation is complete. And there it is. We're going to click on yes. Now while this machine reboots, let's go back and switch to XA01 here and take a look at what we were talking about during the presentation on how you can control your client through group policy objects. So remember when we were installing XenApp, the group policy management console was installed on the XA01 server. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and launch it. Group policy management. And we're going to go ahead and load the group policy management object, or we're going to load the ICA client ADM within our domain policy. So what I'm going to do here is do it under encom, and we're going to go ahead and modify the default domain policy. In your case, it might be a different policy specific to Citrix that you're configuring, but I'm going to right click on it, go to edit. And because this is a computer configuration, so the software is installed on a particular computer, we're going to load it under computer configuration. We are going to go ahead and expand policies here. And as you know, administrative templates or ADM files are loaded under administrative templates. So I'm going to right click, we're going to click on add remove templates, and then we're going to click on add. Now the location of the ICA client.adm, as I told you before, is going to be on the local disk inside of program files, Citrix, ICA client, configuration folder. It's in the configuration folder. And there it is, ICA client.adm. So what you do is once you click on open and it's loaded up here, we're going to click on close. If you expand it a little bit, we're going to expand classic administration, and there you go. You have all of your Citrix components at that point show up here. Let's just go ahead and click this standard, and let's expand this so we can see it all. Now we're not going to go through all of the configuration. Most of these configurations we've configured their counterpart when we were going through the Citrix policies. So what you're doing in this case is that you're configuring the client to accept the policies or override the policies that you created at the server level. So remember, I told you there were policies for the particular server, Citrix policies and group policies, and there are also equivalent policies that control how the ICA client itself behaves, because there are certain policies that need to be enabled at the client level as well in order to take full advantage of it. So what we're going to do here is we're going to expand Citrix components. And you have a whole slew of things that you can configure. So you can allow client connections, obviously. On the network side, if we expand it as well, there's a bunch of things that you can do. You can enable, disable TLS, SSL. This is all for security stuff. Configure trusted servers, etc., etc. Session reliability, you can turn that on and off. From a proxy perspective, you can configure the clients. If they're connecting through a proxy, you can configure all sorts of proxy settings here. Proxy authentication. You can configure SOX proxy if you needed to, etc., etc. From a user authentication perspective, there's a number of different ways by which the user can authenticate. So this is a matter of configuring that ICA client to support these methods, so you can enable or disable certain authentication methods as you see fit. From a remoting client devices perspective, again, here you can configure client drive mapping. So if you go into client drive mappings, you can enable that particular setting, and then you can configure whatever drive mappings that you want or not. So you can tweak that here. You can enable the settings so they can see it, or you can configure it so that they're only read-only client drives, they can't save anything to them, etc., etc. So there's a lot of configurations that you can do here. From a client printer's perspective, again, you can configure that by enabling that particular policy. So there's a lot of different policy here that you can allow or not. If image capture, if you're using any kind of scanner devices and you want the ability for that particular ICA client to pass the images through the ICA session, then you would want to enable this. Client microphone, if you want to allow copy and paste. USB plug and play devices would have to be enabled, and point of sale devices, if their particular function of USB, then you would have to enable it here as well. From a user experience perspective, again, this has got to do with how the client audio settings are handled, how the graphics are going to be handled, the display settings. This is for the graphics. If you go ahead and enable that, there's any number of different compression methods that you can enable here. Make sure you're configuring their counterpart on the server so that the client and the server can communicate properly and negotiate properly. You have client display settings that you can also tweak, window width, size, etc. Those are all settings that we talked about that you can configure, again, at the client level at this point. And then you have the client engine. The client engine allows you to sort of do maintenance or cleanup. So what happens is every time you click on an application icon, whether it's through web interface or outside of web interface, there's an ICA file that gets created and cached inside of the user profile. If you wanted that ICA file to be deleted when the session ends, then you can enable this particular policy, select this option here, and it will delete that file from the user's profile after the session ends and they're not using the application anymore. Now, that's all there is to it from loading the ADM files. I just wanted you to know that it exists, how to load these settings and how to configure them and tweak them. And again, it's all done through group policy, so it makes it easier. Alright, by now the NCOM client 01 should have been rebooted. Let's switch back to that and see what happens. Alright, so we've got that. We've logged in here. So technically now if I click on the up arrow, right click on my application icon here, if I click on applications, technically I should see my streamed applications. And voila, there it is. So I can now launch my streamed applications as well as my content, which is CNN, and my published applications all from the same client. This is really cool. And on top of that, I have access to my published desktop. This is kind of cool. This is fantastic. Alright, so let's go ahead and switch back to our demonstration and recap what we've learned. So in this lesson, we started off by talking about the different plugins that exist within the Citrix family. So Citrix has a lot of plugins. We talked about the online plugin and the fact that it has the PN agent piece of it, which connects into or requires a XenApp services site that enumerates application. We talked about the web plugin, which is a lighter version that basically allows you to visit a full web interface site, log on, launch applications. We talked about the offline plugin and how it's needed for streamed application. We talked about the self-service or the Dazzle plugin, which is needed in conjunction with the merchandising server and allows you to create something like an app store, so to speak, or a software store where you can where users can select the applications that they want. We talked about the Citrix receiver, which is typical on iPads and iPhones, Android devices, and any kind of devices, and how the future of the Citrix plugins will be within Citrix Receiver. However, today the Citrix Receiver is simply a framework for all the other plugins to be able to install and sort of centrally manage all of these different plugins that you have. We talked about how you can customize the online plugin. We also went through and talked about how you can upload the ADM file and manage the plugin through group policy. We talked about how you can install it and configure it via command line. We went through different command line interfaces and installations. We also talked about the creation of a web interface XenApp services site, and we went through and created that and configured that and showed you how it would look from a client perspective. We went through the different command line options that you have for the online plugin, and we also went through the different command line options that you have for the offline plugin, and I also provided links to the different website where you can find all of these commands just in case you wanted to do copy and paste in order to expedite the building of your scripts. Finally, I hope this was informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.